$40 disappears from your pocket and you realize it is gone before nightfall. Nearly $1 million passes through a government ledger, becomes flagged, undergoes review, receives clearance, and gets authorized, yet no one pays attention until the damage is done. This is not an error, but rather a machine operating precisely as it was permitted to function, and earlier today inside room 2141, that very machine was compelled to justify its actions. The chamber had completely filled up long before any significant developments occurred. 289 individuals occupied the seats, the media balcony was packed, and broadcast networks were rolling on what appeared to be a routine inquiry destined for the basement archives, filled with jargon about financial distributions, personnel numbers, and bureaucratic synergy meant to sound complex enough to dodge scrutiny and ambiguous enough to dodge blame. Pam Bondi remained seated in the middle of the spectacle, appearing calm and calculated while reading her scripted statement with the exactness of a veteran who anticipated repeating the performance. She uttered the word transparent 7 times over the course of 12 minutes, and with each utterance, the audience signaled their agreement as though merely repeating a concept could serve as actual evidence. Ted Lieu arrived in that space 43 minutes prior without any media presence, equipped only with documents, a desk, and enough time to determine the precise moment this inquiry would deviate from the standard script. He rearranged 3 separate binders, extracted a single piece of paper, inserted it into an unmarked folder, and positioned it face down near his left side as if it held no significance. However, pacing rather than noise is what shatters the atmosphere of such a chamber, and he was not present to raise his voice, but rather to have the final word. What everyone in that room failed to notice, and what no television station reported later that evening, was the existence of an additional hidden folder. At precisely 9:45 in the morning, 11 minutes into the introductory remarks, a high-ranking staffer slipped it beneath the desk without interrupting the dialogue, altering their stance, or alerting the broadcast lenses. From that specific second onward, 2 entirely different iterations of the proceedings were occurring simultaneously, comprising the public spectacle and the hidden narrative being built without a sound. The official carried on with her testimony, using terms like statistical alignment, lifelong litigators, and procedural integrity, which are phrases designed to project competence while hiding the underlying reality. Her legal counsel occupied the 3 seats to her right, agreeing at specific moments that appeared rehearsed enough to be perfectly timed, presenting a professional, disciplined, and expected front that implied the session would conclude like all others with a lack of clarity, a lack of punishment, and a lack of lasting impact. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted, not due to any spoken words, but rather because of an action that abruptly ceased. Her primary lawyer had failed to lift a writing instrument for nearly 3/4 of a minute. This represented the initial deviation from the norm, as legal representatives in these environments perpetually jot down observations, protests, mental cues, and tactical plans. Whenever the note-taking halts, it indicates that strategic assessment has overtaken instinctive response, and when that shift occurs, it signifies that an unexpected element has breached the perimeter of the proceedings. The representative remained patient, refusing to interject or debate, allowing the witness to complete her thought process because the snare was not the paperwork itself, but rather the response she had just provided. He asked the highest-ranking attorney if she personally examined the approval paperwork for electronic bank movements surpassing $100,000 during her tenure managing monetary resolutions. It was a straightforward inquiry, lacking any hostile undertones or elevated volume, leaving absolutely no space to pivot away without drawing immediate suspicion. She responded precisely in the manner her institutional background had conditioned her to reply, confirming that she reviewed all significant movements as a matter of routine procedure. She delivered this statement with absolute clarity, she offered it without hesitation, and she affirmed it while legally bound to tell the truth. In that fleeting instance, prior to the revealing of any written records or the presentation of any tangible proof, the ultimate resolution of this interaction was irreversibly sealed. This happened because only 2 distinct realities remained, meaning either her declaration was factual or subsequent events would reveal it to be entirely fabricated. An alternative scenario simply cannot exist when a witness provides declarations under the penalty of perjury. Ambiguity vanishes entirely once the official transcript begins recording, and bouncing back is unattainable when your personal statements form the architecture of your own interrogation. The congressman extended his arm toward the folder without any urgency or dramatic flair, extracting one piece of paper and pushing it over the surface until it stopped right beneath her audio equipment. He offered no description of the item, he refrained from outlining its details, and he denied her legal team any window to protest before her gaze locked onto the text. He simply requested that she direct her attention to the materials resting before her, which was the extent of his commentary because the evidence required no verbal introduction. Two separate and objective investigative experts had previously verified the absolute legitimacy of this specific record. The page prominently displayed an official government verification code. It was securely delivered to the Congressional Oversight Panel 21 days prior, and up until this very second, the only individuals aware of its reality were present within those walls. The financial figure listed was an exact sum of $847,000. The banking codes were clearly legible, the exact chronological data was logged, and federal finance experts had internally marked the receiving ledger for questionable behavior prior to the funds settling. That specific warning marker underwent an evaluation process and was subsequently deleted from the system. The document authorizing this deletion consisted of a phrase stating the subject was restricted. There was absolutely no context or elaboration provided, leaving only a secrecy tag positioned precisely where a valid reason ought to reside. Positioned directly under that brief phrase was a space designated for an official endorsement. The witness shifted her gaze downward to the paper without altering the angle of her jaw. Her primary counsel tilted to the side and muttered a statement far too faint for the audio equipment to register. This constituted the next deviation from standard procedure, as a lawyer leaning inward only after evidence materializes signifies that their defensive strategy has fallen behind the facts, meaning the proof outpaced their preparation. The representative refused to apply pressure or reiterate his inquiry, allowing the quietness to stretch out exactly long enough for every person present to grasp the gravity of the situation. This situation did not involve an unauthorized media disclosure, it was not a piece of gossip, and it certainly was not an unnamed informant funneling tips to a journalist. This item represented a government-verified electronic banking record submitted into the legislative archive under the threat of criminal charges by the bank that initiated the movement. Now, this exact paperwork rested a mere 36 inches from the individual who had recently sworn that she individually audited all transactions of such a massive scale. The lawmaker point-blank asked the official to confirm or deny if her autograph appeared on the approval section of the financial resolution paperwork processed during her time in office. He used zero descriptive words, offered no conditional phrases, and engineered no verbal loopholes, relying entirely on a twofold framework that compelled the speaker to pick between two mutually exclusive realities. Answering in the affirmative would serve as an admission that she approved moving capital into a ledger that had already been tagged for questionable financial behavior. Replying in the negative would constitute a claim that the handwriting on a government-verified form belonged to someone else, thus inviting investigations into fraudulent copying, document tampering, or a massive systemic breakdown. Either potential response completely dismantles the narrative she had sworn to be true moments prior, and declining to speak would not bypass the dilemma, but rather highlight its exact nature. The assembled crowd grasped this reality instantly, analyzing the situation not through their feelings but through the fundamental mechanics of the law. Every individual present comprehended the rules of sworn statements, they understood the power of archived documents, and they realized this session had ceased to be an inquiry regarding financial planning or human resources. The gathering had transformed into an accountability test, acting as the precise juncture where the governing apparatus stops accepting excuses and begins insisting upon factual alignment. Factual alignment happens to be the single element that cannot be successfully fabricated while speaking under the penalty of perjury. The witness glanced down at the paperwork once more before shifting her eyes toward her legal representation. Her primary counsel had already retreated against the back of his chair, while her secondary lawyer rested her writing instrument flush against the desk. They drafted no observations and plotted no tactical maneuvers because they had exhausted all calculations capable of altering the fundamental nature of the inquiry. The solitary remaining unknown was her response, and occasionally in environments such as this one, failing to reply serves as the most comprehensive declaration an individual can offer. An appeal for a temporary suspension arrived far too tardily, not due to legal restrictions, but because the interaction was already cemented into the official transcript. After evidence hits the desk, an inquiry hangs in the air, and a sworn speaker receives the chance to reply, the pacing is no longer managed by lawyers, but dictated entirely by the stenographer's ledger. The official record refuses to halt its progression to accommodate legal maneuvering. The defense lawyer politely asked the lawmaker for a short break to permit his client to examine the paperwork alongside her legal team. The primary representative spoke with a calm, deliberate, and procedurally accurate tone, yet his delivery contained a subtle hesitation that every person in the chamber easily detected. This auditory clue represented a profound realization rather than mere uncertainty. It was an acknowledgement that the contents of that specific sheet had advanced beyond the stage where prior coaching would offer any benefit. The representative flatly denied the request. The congressman maintained his volume, kept his posture relaxed, and avoided eye contact with the defense when issuing his denial, treating the moment not as a bargaining session but as an unavoidable legislative outcome. He noted that the paperwork was permanently lodged within the legislative archives. He reminded the room that the official had already sworn to auditing every single financial movement of this massive scale. He stated that he possessed a single inquiry remaining. Every subsequent phrase shrank the perimeter of her potential exit routes, binding her through legal mechanics rather than psychological pressure. This happens because once sworn statements set a baseline claiming universal oversight of massive transactions, any paperwork violating that baseline transforms from mere proof into an active benchmark for evaluation. That specific evaluative process acts as the exact location where trustworthiness either survives or shatters entirely. The witness maintained her total silence. She rested her palms flat against the desk and kept her posture rigid, though the lawmaker sitting nearest to her could visibly detect a slight shift in her respiratory rhythm. Her breaths became brief and tightly regulated, indicating that her mental processing had shifted away from tactical planning and toward assessing impending penalties. The inquiry hung over the chamber without a response, absolutely inescapable and perfectly engineered in its phrasing. The lawmaker once again demanded a binary confirmation regarding whether her handwriting graced the approval section of the banking resolution filed during her administration. Inquiries generally fall into two categories, with some crafted to acquire fresh data and others built strictly to verify established facts. His demand belonged firmly in the latter group, as the foundational facts did not stem from the speaker but rather sprang directly from the paperwork itself. Furthermore, the text possessed absolute validation through dual objective investigators, formal handwriting confirmation, behavioral alignment, a sealed delivery 21 days ago, and a flawless evidentiary trail stretching from the source bank to the congressional panel. This represents the live-action execution of compounding proof, utilizing multiple overlapping tiers of verification instead of a solitary allegation, ensuring that the ultimate inquiry measures a person's compliance with reality rather than searching for it. Her primary legal counsel tilted forward once more for exactly 11 seconds, without a fraction of a moment to spare. The specific length of time holds tremendous weight in pivotal congressional hearings, as brief reactions stem from pure reflex while extended pauses indicate intense strategic assessment. Engaging in strategic assessment during such a crisis implies that the appropriate response lacks clarity, carries immense danger, or guarantees professional destruction. The lawyer scribbled one solitary term onto a yellow notepad, rotating the paper to ensure only his client possessed a clear line of sight. While the remaining attendees could not decipher the handwriting, they all universally comprehended its underlying meaning as a strict parameter rather than helpful guidance. The official corrected her seating angle and consciously anchored her palms to the surface anew, acting as though adjusting her physical stance might somehow repair her tactical vulnerability. She informed the representative that she required a discussion with her lawyers before addressing his highly targeted question. Her phrasing was exceptionally disciplined and meticulously constructed to stall the proceedings without issuing an outright denial. However, deploying a stalling tactic against a yes or no question while legally bound to tell the truth essentially acts as a profound admission. The lawmaker reminded her that she had been sworn in for 120 minutes, and the paperwork had resided within the legislative archive for 21 days. He reiterated his demand that she either validate or reject her personal handwriting on a record manufactured by her own department. He utilized zero-volume increases or theatrical language, relying entirely on extreme conversational pressure. Each subsequent statement eliminated the breathing room between his demand and the pair of absolute responses available to her. Following that exchange, an absolute void of activity occurred. Time ticked away steadily as 10, 20, and then 30 seconds evaporated. While quietness represents a void in normal circumstances, it functions as hard data in these specific environments, subject to measurement, documentation, and intense analysis. Just past the half-minute mark, the broadcast switched to a broader angle displaying lawmakers making minor adjustments in their seats while aides exchanged knowing looks. An environment previously defined by rigorous, orderly dialogue now hung entirely frozen upon one lingering issue. Over a minute later, the visual feed snapped back to the witness, capturing a disciplined expression, a forward gaze, and a complete lack of motion. Yet the events transpiring during that visual gap bypassed the television audience and landed directly in the lap of the official court reporter. This reality exists because directors manipulate television feeds, whereas legal records capture absolute continuity. Every passing moment and hesitation finds its way onto the page, and at the 92-second mark, the ledger officially branded the official as uncooperative, confirming what the chamber had already deduced. That specific duration provided ample opportunity for all attendees to realize the central problem had shifted away from the paperwork and toward her inability to safely reply. The dynamic then pivoted rapidly, originating not from the official but from her legal representative. The attorney announced that his client was invoking her constitutional protections against self-incrimination to avoid addressing the lawmaker's inquiry at the current moment. This statement served not as a rejection, an explanation, or a fix, but rather as a formal legal shield. Triggering this safeguard is far from an impartial move. It acts as a judicial tool specifically engineered to stop an individual from admitting to criminal liability. By its very nature, deploying this defense indicates that offering a truthful response while legally bound carries a danger the speaker refuses to shoulder. This specific nuance remains crucial, as seeking constitutional refuge does not equal a confession, but it absolutely verifies legal vulnerability. It stops short of validating corrupt behavior, yet it solidifies the fact that speaking aloud could trigger criminal penalties. Within an environment featuring a yes or no demand, validated paperwork, and archived sworn statements, this acknowledged vulnerability anchors every subsequent action taken. The crowd offered no gasps or sudden movements, as all attendees recognized they had instantly transitioned from standard supervision into the realm of criminal culpability. The congressman shifted his focus from the paperwork to the panel leader, abandoning his intense scrutiny of the witness entirely. He formally stated for the official archives that the subject had refused to validate her handwriting on a government-sanctioned financial approval record while sworn in before the panel. That specific phrasing carries immense weight because it converts actions into binding judicial terminology, stripping away ambiguity and locking the event into an unalterable format. He drafted a short intentional message functioning as an official recommendation for further investigation. By the following day, this recommendation would reach the internal watchdog, acting not as a smear but as a mandatory bureaucratic reaction. This occurs because whenever sworn words, concrete evidence, and non-compliance collide, the oversight mechanism bypasses debate and immediately advances to higher authorities. At this exact juncture, a secondary, silent, and invisible phase initiates its progression. The paperwork resting on the desk was accompanied by an unopened, unread folder whose mere presence radically altered the context of the entire preceding event. That hidden folder contained a federal investigative summary detailing a veteran prosecutor's testimony regarding coercive efforts to delete the warning marker associated with that specific monetary exchange. The evidentiary trail remained completely unbroken, stretching from the initial interview to an internal audit and finally landing at the legislative panel. Consequently, the banking maneuver ceased to be a standalone incident, transforming into a thoroughly logged and interconnected chain of evaluations, approvals, and authorizations. This specific distinction separates a simple inquiry from a comprehensive criminal investigation. An inquiry merely seeks out events, whereas an investigation demonstrates the exact mechanics of the occurrence, identifying the participants and the choices executed at every juncture. The representative left the folders sealed because the true force of a factual record often lies in its concealment rather than its presentation. Simply suggesting the existence of the information provides sufficient leverage. While the initial paper proves an inconsistency, the hidden report proves deliberate motivation. While the exposed record demands a binary choice, the concealed evidence clarifies why both options guarantee destruction. The entire audience recognized that this tactic operated devoid of political bias in both its architecture and its delivery. This represented a litigator's strategy deployed within a legislative arena, designed to construct the archive, secure the spoken claims, reveal the proof, and demand reconciliation. Direct allegations become unnecessary because when the physical evidence carries the narrative, the inquiry ceases attempting to convince and focuses entirely on verification. The official's 92 seconds of absolute quiet accomplished more than any spoken word, exposing her limits, highlighting her jeopardy, and pinpointing the exact threshold where legal compliance dissolved into criminal vulnerability. After navigating past that specific boundary, the narrative abandons verbal claims and focuses strictly on verifiable facts. The aftermath of invoking constitutional protections does not yield chaos. Rather, it yields intense categorization. All prior declarations face renewed scrutiny, all physical proof gains altered significance, and all missing data transforms into critical evidence. Once an individual refuses to speak due to fears of criminal liability, investigators stop soliciting new information and begin aggressively testing previously archived claims. In this particular scenario, the official had provided two separate declarations that fundamentally contradicted one another. During a fall hearing before the intelligence panel, the witness swore she lacked specific awareness regarding massive financial resolutions tethered to secret government operations. This was an unambiguous maneuver, placing her beyond the scope of authorization, serving to actively minimize her personal culpability. During the morning session in room 2141, she swore that she individually audited every single significant monetary movement as a routine duty, leaving zero room for delegated tasks or exceptions. Now evaluate those dual declarations concurrently. If her auditing procedures are truly universal, then a transaction approaching $1 million easily triggers her mandatory oversight. If she truly possessed no awareness of this movement, then either her staff ignored the rules or her previous testimony was entirely false. These conflicting realities simply cannot coexist simultaneously. The instant she triggered her constitutional shield, this logical paradox transformed into a tangible crisis. This process represents the exact mechanics of a false testimony investigation right before it matures into an official indictment. It relies upon clinical juxtaposition rather than elevated voices or sensationalized news banners. The method utilizes dual chronological markers and a pair of conflicting quotes bound within a singular archive. Resting directly between these declarations is the validated banking paperwork, hidden from public view and ignored by journalists, yet perfectly engineered to collide with her claims at precisely the right second. This outcome does not represent random chance, but rather meticulous tactical alignment. The evidentiary trail of that specific file remains paramount because it completely nullifies any claims of forgery. The path stretched from the bank to government archives, triggered by a legislative transparency request 14 months prior, followed by an executive blockade, a subsequent challenge, and the eventual release of an exemption inventory. Curiously, the approval paperwork currently sitting on the desk was entirely absent from that specific exemption inventory. This missing information functions not as a minor clerical error but as a massive warning flare. This occurs because an exemption inventory serves as a legally binding catalog of restricted materials rather than a simple checklist. Any record shielded by executive protection requires proper identification, cataloging, and an explicit rationale for its concealment. If the approval paperwork failed to appear on the registry, it guarantees one of two possible realities occurred. Officials either purposely hid the document or they legitimately failed to identify it as relevant data during the initial search. Both possibilities possess severe ramifications. Purposeful removal sparks accusations of a cover-up, whereas an accidental oversight sparks accusations of severe managerial incompetence. Managerial authority remains the absolute core of this entire dispute. Investigators need to identify the informed parties, the approving authorities, the individuals who scrubbed the warning markers, and the final signatories. Government financial experts tagged the receiving ledger prior to the finalization of the money movement. This tagging process operates manually, springing into action due to behavioral tracking, massive financial volume, suspicious transit paths, and questionable archival data. The warning marker underwent an audit, signifying that a living person had to make a conscious choice regarding its fate. The subsequent deletion of that marker represents an entirely separate conscious choice. The paperwork authorizing this scrub relied entirely on a brief phrase asserting the subject was legally restricted. Applying a secrecy label functions as a bureaucratic mechanism rather than a legitimate justification. It successfully blocks outside visibility without actually validating the underlying behavior. Consequently, investigators must determine whether the secrecy applied to the receiving ledger, the motivation behind the movement, or the ultimate beneficiary of the funds. Utilizing secrecy labels in this manner does not evaporate oversight. It merely shifts the inquiry into secure arenas like internal watchdogs, departmental audits, and classified briefings. This secure transition highlights exactly why the hidden folder remains incredibly important. The federal interview report detailed a lifelong prosecutor's claims regarding a coercive effort designed to eliminate the warning marker on that exact banking ledger. The term coercive effort holds tremendous weight, suggesting targeted commands, undue persuasion, and a total collapse of standard auditing protocols. Furthermore, the evidentiary trail for this interview report remained absolutely flawless as it traveled from the prosecutor to the internal watchdog and ultimately to the legislative panel, suffering zero interruptions or vulnerabilities. This unbroken trail essentially elevates a piece of paper into a comprehensive timeline. While the banking record proves the capital shift, the warning marker proves apprehension, the deletion proves meddling, and the interview report proves the underlying motive. While isolated components spark curiosity, their combined weight constructs an undeniable architecture of events. At this precise moment, the inquiry abandons the public spectacle and zeroes in on the hidden framework supporting it. While television audiences obsessed over the tense dialogue, the quiet pauses, and the constitutional dodges, the true trap had already been set through 14 months of paperwork battles, appellate rulings, a flawed exemption inventory, a secure delivery, and a permanently sealed folder. This spectacle represents an entire bureaucratic machine rather than a fleeting instance. Bureaucracies never collapse at a single juncture. They shatter across numerous procedural checkpoints where isolated choices seem reasonable until they are evaluated as a collective whole. Examine the deletion of the warning marker as a prime example. If the subject truly required secrecy, then officials should possess a logged mandate, a valid rationale, a designated leader, and defined parameters for that restriction. If someone formally approved the document, then auditors should easily locate evaluative commentary, supplementary files, and contextual data explaining why a suspicious ledger received clearance. If the exemption inventory ignored the approval paperwork, then the department owes an explanation, an official amendment, or an updated registry to address the failure. These steps are not mere suggestions, but absolute regulatory mandates. Whenever officials ignore, fail to log, or actively hide these mandates, the core problem shifts away from the banking transfer and lands squarely on the corrupted framework that permitted it. Ethical considerations enter the arena at this exact point, serving as a tangible penalty rather than a political talking point. That massive sum of money did not travel through a vacuum, but rather through an apparatus financed by taxpayers that requires every single cent to remain visible, justified, and fully auditable. Envision a miniaturized scenario involving a municipal branch where taxpayer money triggers a warning, receives clearance, gets authorized, and later surfaces without any logical rationale. Although the financial footprint would shrink, the fundamental violation of ethics would remain perfectly mirrored. Institutional faith does not scale based on monetary volume. It relies entirely upon the uniform application of established regulations. In this specific case, officials either obeyed protocols and generated an incomprehensible outcome, or they abandoned protocols and generated an outcome that went unchallenged. Either pathway inevitably leads investigators directly toward the search for the responsible party. This pursuit targets structural liability rather than political affiliation. This situation entirely transcends partisan loyalties. The paperwork pledges no allegiance, the handwriting harbors no political philosophy, and the evidentiary timeline remains completely indifferent to the specific individuals occupying the chamber. The central crisis revolves around whether the apparatus dictating legal compliance actually submits to the identical benchmarks of transparency, uniformity, and responsibility that it extracts from the general public. The congressman avoided lobbing direct accusations of criminality, opting instead to present her with her own archived actions and demanding she reconcile the two. This specific tactic prioritizes stark juxtaposition over aggressive bickering. Furthermore, when she failed to reconcile the facts and refused to supply an answer, the governing apparatus did not shatter, but instead marched forward. This forward momentum generated an internal watchdog recommendation, triggered the threat of judicial demands for supplementary files, and guaranteed a massive increase in the scope of collected paperwork. Once a sworn paradox materializes, the subsequent phase abandons arguments in favor of aggressively hoarding more records, acquiring more testimony, and mapping out further areas of consistency or friction. This precise mechanical shift illustrates how a standard inquiry matures into a formal probe, relying on organized frameworks rather than sheer noise. That framework is already glaringly obvious, constructed from dual declarations, a solitary file, a constitutional dodge, a hidden dossier, and a glaring omission within an exemption registry. Every single component remains permanently locked within the archives, entirely immovable without instantly spawning an additional logical paradox. This represents the exact posture the governing apparatus currently maintains, functioning as a rigidly defined reality rather than a speculative theory. The solitary unknown lingering in the air centers on precisely how far investigators will push these boundaries. The impending fallout relies strictly on bureaucratic mechanics rather than theatrical flair. Bureaucratic mechanics, when executed to their absolute conclusion, pose a far greater threat than any verbal allegation ever hurled within that chamber. While targets can easily reject verbal allegations, they possess absolutely no defense against administrative momentum. Within a single day, the recommendation bypasses the television networks and the journalists entirely, landing securely on the desk of the internal watchdog. This transition holds massive importance because an internal watchdog prosecutes inquiries in a radically different manner than a standard politician. Their arena lacks a cheering crowd, theatrical grandstanding, and ticking clocks, relying solely upon defined parameters, legal authority, and endless stacks of paperwork. Their initial phase mandates rigorous juxtaposition, pitting quotes against quotes and files against files. They ignore underlying inferences and focus exclusively on spoken vocabulary. The fall declarations confirmed a complete lack of specific awareness regarding massive financial movements linked to restricted government operations. The morning declarations confirmed the individual auditing of every significant monetary shift as a standard procedure. When positioned adjacently, these claims do not demand nuanced analysis, but rather absolute factual alignment. If alignment proves unattainable, investigators must determine whether either declaration qualifies as a substantial lie. They are hunting for substantial lies, completely discarding minor exaggerations or statements lacking proper nuance. That specific boundary operates as a strict judicial standard rather than a feeling. Substantiality dictates that the provided information possess the actual power to sway the outcome of the specific hearing where it was uttered. Within an intelligence panel or a legislative oversight meeting, assertions regarding the awareness and management of banking movements serve as the absolute core of the inquiry, rather than mere footnotes. Now introduce the banking record, the electronic movement, the autograph section, the warning marker, and the deletion order into the equation. Every single item possesses standalone validation, tethers to an exact chronological moment, and links together through an evidentiary trail that has already withstood preliminary challenges. This is the precise juncture where the formal probe constricts rather than balloons outward. This constriction occurs because investigators no longer need to comprehend the incident, as the incident itself is completely archived. The new objective focuses entirely on assigning personal liability within the parameters of that archived incident. They must discover the specific identities of the auditor who assessed the marker, the official who permitted its deletion, the signatory on the paperwork, the employee who filed the secrecy tag, and the manager who excluded the approval sheet from the exemption registry. These represent highly specific demands aimed like lasers at solitary employees rather than faceless departments. The governing apparatus grows incredibly tense during this phase because sprawling agencies dilute blame, whereas solitary employees are forced to shoulder it entirely. While an agency can vaguely claim that protocols were respected, a human being must physically admit to executing the action. Furthermore, when a human faces that demand while sworn in and triggers their constitutional shield, the governing apparatus does not automatically brand them a criminal, but it absolutely eradicates all lingering doubt regarding their vulnerability. Doubt only thrives in environments overflowing with competing narratives. Triggering a constitutional shield only occurs when the truthful narrative threatens severe judicial penalties. That specific separation represents the most vital element of the entire ordeal. Now evaluate those 92 seconds once more, viewing them strictly as an expanse of time rather than a lack of noise. A full minute and a half evaporated without a single verbal reply. For 92 seconds, the entire chamber witnessed a high-stakes calculation unfolding live, focusing entirely on what could safely be uttered in the current moment rather than what occurred historically. That specific time frame acts as the precise border where storytelling perishes and severe repercussions initiate. Prior to that agonizing pause, officials could still successfully package the inquiry as a standard bureaucratic procedure. Following that pause, maintaining such an illusion became completely impossible. While the official ledger ignores vocal inflections, fails to document anxiety, and misses the visual cues between lawyers or physical adjustments, it flawlessly archives the lack of a response. The speaker refused to reply. Within an archive of this magnitude, that specific terminology operates as a glaring beacon rather than an impartial observation. It informs all future auditors, detectives, and judicial experts reviewing the files that an individual encountered, a demand they could not safely satisfy within an environment built entirely upon mandatory compliance. That beacon never dims, avoids all editorial scrubbing, resists media spin, and remains permanently lodged in history. Now factor in the unseen television gap encompassing the 18 seconds separating the broad camera angle and the tight focus on the official's expression. This gap contained the exact instant her legal counsel drafted a solitary term. It represented the precise second the defensive strategy was permanently cemented. Although those moments evaded the television feed, they survive within the chronological record, and investigative timelines undergo brutal fractional reconstruction. This rigorous reconstruction occurs because optical voids frequently overflow with circumstantial data. Detectives need to know the identities of the speakers, the physical movers, the instigator of the constitutional shield, and the individual who recommended its deployment. These components operate as vital pieces of the chronological puzzle rather than vague trivia, and establishing a strict timeline serves as the primary method for deducing deliberate motivation. Now withdraw your focus from the immediate chamber This crisis extends far beyond one isolated banking movement, a solitary autograph, or even a single deployment of constitutional protections. The overarching dilemma focuses on whether the vast machine demanding regulatory obedience possesses the power to function completely immune to its own rules. Daily, average citizens face demands to justify significantly smaller financial sums while enduring absolutely zero leniency for accounting errors. A minor deviation of several $1,000s easily launches severe audits. A simple verbal error sparks heavy fines, and a lack of transparency practically guarantees aggressive prosecution. The governing apparatus preserves its legitimacy entirely through the relentless uniform application of these standards. If this identical apparatus permits nearly $1 million to bypass numerous checkpoints, trigger warnings, receive clearance, gain secrecy tags, acquire authorizations, and vanish from an exemption registry without logical justification, the fundamental crisis transitions away from the money and lands directly on the broken regulatory benchmark itself. Furthermore, regulatory benchmarks subjected to selective enforcement inevitably mutate and spread, permanently altering operational norms and broadcasting clear signals to all institutional players regarding the exact boundaries of acceptable corruption. Absolute uniformity, rather than manufactured anger or political tribalism, serves as the true ethical core of this entire situation. The public must discover whether judicial mandates govern all tiers of the hierarchy equally, or if those mandates warp according to a person's rank, power, and insider connections. Bureaucratic results, rather than theatrical floor speeches, provide the only legitimate answer to this pressing inquiry. The true test determines if the watchdog recommendation sparks aggression, if judges forcibly extract supplementary files, if agencies revise their exemption registries, and if investigators stretch the evidentiary timeline to capture the internal emails and digital memos justifying the previously archived choices. Alternatively, the test will reveal if this explosive confrontation simply dies within the committee walls, destined to be formally logged, briefly recognized, and ultimately swallowed whole without a single penalty issued. Institutional assimilation, rather than outright rejection, remains the most viable and dangerous alternative outcome. It represents a governing apparatus that meticulously archives every violation yet completely refuses to reform its behavior. At this specific phase, external observers merge with the unfolding crisis, as civilian scrutiny functions as a highly volatile catalyst rather than a dormant force. Formal probes bathed in the spotlight generally march forward, while probes shrouded in darkness almost always grind to a permanent halt. This stalling occurs due to evaporating societal demands rather than shifting evidentiary realities. Therefore, the pressing mystery abandons the historical events of Room 2141 as those occurrences are already cemented in stone. Paperwork hit the desk, a lawmaker issued a demand, a witness withheld a reply, a constitutional shield deployed, and a formal recommendation advanced. The current mystery revolves entirely around the fate of this chronological chain once it exits the immediate chamber. The public awaits clarification on whether this chain will successfully navigate the gauntlet built to evaluate it, or if it will inevitably crash the moment the political temperature rises too high. This specific dilemma targets the governing apparatus as a whole rather than the individual seated at the witness table. The bureaucratic machine currently possesses every single tool required for a resolution. It controls the sworn declarations, the physical paperwork, the chronological map, and the unbroken evidentiary trail. Absolutely zero vital components remain absent from the equation. Therefore, the public must aggressively question the true source of the hesitation. If legal responsibility during sworn testimony holds any actual value, then this specific crisis marks the boundary where that value is either aggressively proven or permanently abandoned. If archived evidence truly matters, then this juncture dictates whether officials hunt down the final truths or simply bury the files in a basement. If uniform application of the rules carries weight, then this event either proves that uniformity or exposes the rules as entirely subjective. Investigators require zero supplementary data to launch their assault, needing only the willpower to make a choice. Furthermore, authorities will not broadcast this choice during a legislative session, they will not package it within a scripted press release, and they will not neatly condense it into a news banner. The ultimate decision will manifest strictly through tangible administrative maneuvers. Officials will either issue judicial demands or embrace the quiet, broaden the scope or throttle the inquiry, and pursue finality or weaponize stagnation. These represent the absolute limits of possibility once an archive of this magnitude materializes. Therefore, you must pose this critical inquiry to your own conscience. If a governing apparatus can successfully archive a sworn paradox, officially log a defiant silence, validate the underlying proof, and yet still refuse to execute penalties, what exact behavioral baseline is it actually attempting to uphold? Even more crucially, the public deserves to know precisely which tier of citizens actually bears the weight of that baseline. If you harbor the conviction that judicial mandates must operate uniformly regardless of a person's societal rank, then this spectacle represents far more than a fleeting political broadcast to consume and abandon. This situation functions as a massive institutional stress test. It evaluates whether the foundation of justice remains intact when weaponized against the absolute apex of the political hierarchy. It determines if bureaucratic mechanics actually generate tangible penalties or simply produce endless stacks of meaningless archives. Please engage with this content if you believe personal liability should remain blind to an individual's power, and share your thoughts below regarding whether a sworn defiant should instantly launch aggressive countermeasures. Distribute this analysis to individuals who dismiss legislative inquiries as mere theatrics, and ensure you follow this channel, as the impending chapter of this saga will unfold far from the broadcast lenses, yet absolutely dictate the future of our republic.